Gute Woche. Der Rebbe soll gesund sein, begann der Farbrengen. Today is Shabbos HaGodel. The title for this Shabbos HaGodel is not just something which was added on, but the source for the title is something which is mentioned in Svarim. It is mentioned al pi Chassidus, and it is also al pi Halacha. And in Shulchan Aruch we find an entire siman where the Shulchan Aruch discusses this Shabbos and refers to it with the title of Shabbos HaGodel, that it is a big Shabbos. The fact that even in Halacha it is considered so with this title Shabbos HaGodel, the Rebbe continues, is because we know in Torah at times there's an inyan which it is not so in Halacha, but it is still Torah. As we know, Eilu va'Eilu, Divrei Elokim Chayim, when we have two opinions in an inyan, we say both of them are Torah. The Halacha should be that way. The opinion according to whom Halacha should be, this is already a higher Madrega in Torah. This is a Madrega in Torah which the Gemara tells us, V'Hashem imoi, Shahalacha kemoisai. If Hashem is with somebody, then he's merited, he's rewarded that the halacha is like him. In our case, that this Shabbos is referred to as Shabbos HaGodel, and it is so in halacha, so not only does it go through the stage of Divrei Elokim Chayim, but it's also reached a higher madrega, the madrega of Hashem imoy, of Hashem being with it, that this Shabbos, it's al pi halacha, so that this Shabbos has the title Shabbos HaGodel, it is a big Shabbos. In Shulchan Aruch it is explained what is so special about this Shabbos. So that Shulchan Aruch tells us, the Rebbe tells us in Shulchan Aruch, that it was before the Yidden left Mitzrayim, on Yud Nissen, they each took the Korban Pesach into their homes and tied it to the Kari Hamita, as the expression is, to the foot, to the legs of their beds. And the Korban Pesach was something which was the Avodah Zarah of Mitzrayim. So this aroused amongst the Mitzrim anger. What are the Yidden doing? And then when the Mitzrim found out a little more what's happening, that the Rebishter said that he's going to bring a Makkah which is Makkah's B'choros. So the B'chorim began demanding that the Yidden be released because they were afraid for their lives. So this led to a war between the Mitzrim and the B'chorim. This is what we say, L'Makkah Mitzrayim B'choreim. There was a Makkah which was brought upon the Mitzrim. Which Makkah was that? Amongst themselves they were fighting, the Mitzrim and their own B'chorim. And Shulchan Aruch goes on and tells us that actually we should have set aside this date as Yud Nisan. Why was it set for the Shabbos before Pesach? The Shabbos before Pesach is not always Yud Nisan. Today it is Ches Nisan. It could be different dates. It could be Erev Pesach. It could be all kind of different dates. So Shulchan Aruch goes on because Yud Nisan is the day when Miriam passed away. Miriam, Moshe and Aaron's sister, passed away on Yud Nisan. So the Chachamim found it not suitable to set a day of celebration on the day when Miriam passed away. And therefore, it was said that it rather be always on Shabbos HaGodel. In other words, the Shabbos before Pesach, this is when we celebrate this great nest which HaKadosh Baruch Hu made, that the Mitzrim amongst themselves were fighting, L'Makkah Mitzrayim B'choreim, and no one said anything to the Yidden for the fact that the Yidden took the sheep, which was the Avodah Zarah of Mitzrayim, and the Yidden were preparing to shechtus for a Korban Pesach, and so they did. So this celebration is on this day of Shabbos HaGodel. Firstly, the Rebbe says, there's a question which arises. How about all the years when the Yidden were in the Midbar? Miriam was still alive. So the question arises, throughout all these years, When did the Yidden then celebrate this Nes? In other words, this inyan of Shabbos HaGadol, obviously, that it should be on Shabbos and not on Yud Nisan, this was arranged after Miriam's passing away. However, as long as Miriam was alive, the question arises, when was this day celebrated? This was something which the Rebbe just raised the issue and did not get into details, did not get into a lengthy explanation on it. Getting back to Shabbos HaGadol, so this is the only Nes, the Rebbe says, which we find we celebrate something where Goyim amongst Goyim were fighting. Every Yontif, every Inyan which we have, which Yidden celebrate, which we celebrate at Yontif, is always involved Yidden and Goyim. Here we stress that this was a day when the Goyim amongst themselves were fighting, something very strange. The Mitzrim and the Preire Mitzrayim, the firstborns of Mitzrayim, they were involved in a battle. Naturally it was regarding the Yidden, but at the same time it was something which at that time at least, it was a confrontation between the Mitzrayim and Preire Mitzrayim, and this is something which we celebrate today in Shabbos HaGadol. What is the lesson which we can derive from the whole inyan of Shabbos HaGadol? So the Rebbe says that there's a maimah from the Frierdiker Rebbe based on the pasuk V'chol bonayich lemudei Hashem the Rav Shloim bonayich. It's a pasuk which we recited in davening, which means V'chol bonayich lemudei Hashem. All the children of God are considered limudei Hashem, learning from Hashem. We are students, and who is our Rebbe? Hashem, the Rebbe is our Rebbe. So there's a maimah from the Frierdiker Rebbe where the Frierdiker Rebbe explains this whole concept at length, how every single Yid is considered a student, a disciple of the Rabbeinu Shalom. And the Rabbeinu Shalom teaches Torah to every single Yid. If, based on this, we know the Chazal tell us that a Talmid Chacham is always in the level of Shabbos. The world, the days of the world, the weekday, is divided, we know, during the week, as Sheshes Yimei HaMaaseh. Yom v'layla lo yishbaisu. There's no concept of rest during the week. However, it comes Shabbos we are supposed to rest. What does Shabbos HaGadol tell us? And here it brings a message to every Yid, because every Yid is in the Madrega of Shabbos. Every Yid is in the Madrega of being a disciple of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shabbos HaGadol tells us that even in the Madrega of Shabbos, obviously Shabbos is a Madrega of rest. So we are told that even in this Madrega of Shvisa, of resting, it is not something a permanent level. Even in this Madrega we could also go higher and higher. That is why there is a regular Shabbos and there's Shabbos HaGadol. Shabbos HaGadol means the great Shabbos. In other words, we are told that even in the Madrega of Shvisa, of sitting back, we're holding back from doing work. Still we are told the spiritual sense, however, even in the level of Shabbos, we can keep on going higher and higher. And this is what Shabbos HaGadol teaches us. The Rebbe continues that going back into Jewish history, there are many Jewish communities, especially in Yemei HaBinayim, in the medieval generations, times. And these communities, the Rebbe says, have adopted the title of Kehila Kadisha, a holy congregation. And the Rebbe says they really lived up to these titles in these communities. And we find in various Sidurim and Machzorim from those communities that they had special tefillas to say on the Shabbos which fell out before a Yontif. Not only Shabbos HaGadol, Shabbos before Shavuos, as well as the Shabbos before Sukkot, and they referred to this Shabbos as Shabbos HaGadol. Rabbi says, fine. However, this is no contradiction to the fact that Shabbos HaGadol, the Shabbos before Pesach, is still more of a Shabbos HaGadol than those Shabbosim. The Shabbosim before the other Yomim Tovim are referred to we refer to them as Shabbos HaGadol, because before every Yontif we have certain halachas to learn before the Yontif. Even Shavuos, which does not have that many details, still the Shabbos before Shavuos, it is still appropriate to gather people in shuls and teach them all the halachas which are negei yontif. The Rebbe says there's a medrash based on the pasuk of Vayakhel Moshe, that Moshe congregated and gathered all the Yidden. So the medrash there tells us at length how important it is that before every yontif to teach the halachas of the yontif to the entire community. The Rebbe says we have even a personal life of a person, there's also a concept of a Shabbos HaGodel. The Rebbe says this is the Shabbos before one's chasana. The Shabbos before a person's chasana, that is when he has his ufruf, when he's called up to the Torah. The reason him being called up to the Torah on that Shabbos, the Rebbe says, is that the base of life, the life which he's entering through his marriage, should be based on Torah. The Rebbe says if you were to touch up the word ufruf, uf means an elevation, to go up higher. Memela, it's the same idea as a Shabbos HaGodel. But this is a Shabbos HaGodel in everyone's individual life. However, the real sense of Shabbos HaGodel, in other words, where the expression of Shabbos HaGodel could really be utilized to its fullest extent, in other words, how great all these Shabbosim are, whether the Shabbos before every Yontif, or the Shabbos before one's Chasana. However, Shabbos HaGodel, the Shabbos before Pesach, this is really Shabbos HaGodel. Because really great Nisim happened on this day. But as mentioned, Shabbos HaGodel mustn't necessarily be on any set date in the month of Nisan. It could be on various dates. For example, today, Shabbos HaGodel comes out to be on the day of Ches Nisan, 8 days in the month of Nisan. If we want to look into Ches Nisan, Rebbe says we have a very simple approach. Nisan, we recite a Nasi daily. Today is the Yom HaShmini of the Nasi. Yom HaShmini, we find regarding the 8 day very positive things, very great things. Which Nasi brought his karm on the Yom HaShmini? It was the Nasi of Shevet Menashe. Rabbi says if we look in a little bit into the relation of Menashe and Ephraim, and each one of the Shvatim brought their karm on this day. So regarding Menashe, we find that, going back to Chumash Bereishis, we find that Menashe had a closeness to his father Yosef, as opposed to Ephraim, that Yaakov, the grandfather, really expressed the closeness to Ephraim. And that is why we read in Chumash that before Yaakov passed away, Yaakov gave a blessing to both of his grandchildren, Ephraim and Menashe. Yaakov wanted to put his right hand not on the older one, he wanted to put his right hand on Ephraim. Comes Yosef, his son, and tells his father he should not put the right hand on Ephraim, but the right hand should go on Menashe, because ki hu ha'bchoyer. Rabbi says the question arises, we're talking about somebody, about Yosef. And the Torah is telling us incidents which happened between Yosef and his father. We know that Yosef lived up to the highest standard of Kibbud Av, of honoring his father. The Rebbe says the Medrash points out that if we look into the Parsha, we will notice that it was 3 times, not once, 3 times, that Yosef corrected his father and told him that he should put his right hand on Menashe and not on Ephraim. Even if Yosef did it for whatever reason, why does the Torah relate it to us now? We know how careful the Torah is and the covet of everybody. So here the Torah should relate something which actually, apparently, it is not so befitting and not so honorable for Yosef to do something like that. And this, the Rebbe says, is a question which the 5-year-old child who's learning Chumash should be confronted with such a question. What's going on? Yosef is telling that to his father, Yaakov, and the Torah is telling it, and the Torah is relating it with such detail that the Torah is mentioning 3 times how Yosef tried to point out to his father that the right hand really belongs on Menashe. The Rebbe says this can be explained. The Gemara tells us that a father should treat all his children equal. Because if a father does treat somebody different than the others, we see what happened when Yaakov treated Yosef different. Treated him different, the Torah tells us. he made a ksoines pasim, he made a special silk shirt which he gave only to Yosef, and this aroused envy amongst the brothers, and ultimately this led to the sale of Yosef, and Yosef going down to Mitzrayim and everything else which it brought with it. Memele Yosef knew the consequences when one child is treated different than the others. And he knew what it could lead to. He went through it in his personal life. That is why Yosef did not want to let his father do the same by giving preference to Ephraim. At the time Ephraim was not the prayer. Why should Yaakov do that? So that is why Yosef was so bothered with this, because Yosef in his own personal life went through something very similar and very obvious. So Yosef knew what it could lead to. Yaakov, on the other hand, did not know that the reason Yosef was sold was because of the silk shirt he gave to Yosef, the ksoines pasim, and therefore vayikanu bayechav. His brothers envied Yosef and did not, because they saw that Yaakov is treating Yosef better than he treated them. Yaakov's view on this whole thing was an entirely different one. Yaakov's view was, Yaakov knew that the Rebbe said that his children will have to go to Galus. The Rebbe told it yet to Avram Avinu that there will be an Indian of Galus. Mele, Yaakov looked at this, that this was the beginning of the Galus. So Yaakov really did not see any connection between the sale of Yosef and Yosef's going down to Mitzrayim and him giving preference now whether it was to Ephraim or to Menashe. B'negei Menashe, we find later something very interesting. The Rebbe continues. When the Yidden were about to enter Eretz Yisrael, when the Yidden entered Eretz Yisrael, we know that there were 2.5 Shvatim which remained on the other side of the Yarni. Who were these 2.5 Shvatim? Reuven, Gad, and part of Shevet Menashe. Shevet Menashe was divided. In other words, Menashe was half in the Ever HaYarden, and half of Menashe entered Eretz Yisrael. If we look into those psukim where this inyan is discussed, so we find that it was the Bnei Gad and the Bnei Reuven who asked for Ever HaYarden. And Moshe criticized them. Moshe told them it's not right. Your brethren are going to have to cross the Yarden and have a battle there. How can you let them go alone? Until they finally made the arrangement that they will go along for the battle and they will return later back to Ever HaYarden. Discussing this inyan, the Rebbe says, why take did the Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven need Ever HaYarden? They claimed they had many cattle. They had a lot of cattle, a lot of feed. So therefore they needed, it was better for them to reside in Ever HaYarden rather than in Eretz Yisrael. Why did they have more cattle than the rest of the Shvatim? The Rebbe explained, gave this explanation. He says Reuven was the oldest. Reuven was a Pchoyer. We know that a Pchoyer gets double Nachla, inherits a double portion than the rest of the brothers. So that is why Reuven simply had much more than the rest of the Shvatim, because he took from Yaakov a double in the Yerusha. So he took a double in the Yerusha. Therefore they had much more behemoths than all the other Shvatim, and Ever HaYarden was a suitable place for the behemoths to be fed. So that is why they requested to be given Ever HaYarden. B'negei Gad, the Rebbe says, the Rebbe says it's brought in Svarim, this explanation. On the man, there's an expression, when the Torah discusses the man, the Torah uses an expression, the man is Kizra Gad Lovan. The word God is used when the Torah wants to explain the man. Rabbi says it's brought in Svarim that Shevet Gad had a special closeness to the man. What's the pshat? They had more satisfaction from the man than any other of the Shvatim. And by doing this, they utilized less of their behemoths. They did not have to eat that much of their meat, of their own meat. So that's why they had more meat, more cattle than the rest of the Shvatim. That is B'negei Reuven and Gad. Why did half of Menashe select to remain in Ever HaYarden? Rabbi says here, if we look into the Psukim, we will see that when Moshe criticized them for asking for Ever HaYarden and not wanting, as originally he thought, that they will not join in and coming along in the battle, and therefore he spoke very strong words to them. Who did he speak these strong words to? Only to Reuven and God, not to the half of Menashe. Why? Because the reason Menashe wanted to reside in Eretz Yisrael, in Ever HaYarden, was a completely different reason. It's brought in Svarim that when the Yidden entered Eretz Yisrael, they took over the land of the Zion Ummos. 7 nations. However, when Mashiach will come, we will be given additional territory, also the entire Ever HaYarden, which is Keni, Knizi, and Kadmoni, 3 additional countries which will be given to us. The Bnei Menashe, even when they entered Eretz Yisrael, then wanted to have some sort of a taste what it will be like when Mashiach will come. And that is why they then wanted also part of Ever HaYarden, because Ever HaYarden is something where Keni, Knizi, and Kadmoni reside, and this will be first given to Yidden when the Yidden will get that when Mashiach will come. However, they already wanted to have a taste of what Eretz Yisrael will be like when Mashiach will come. That is why they chose to be split, the Shevet. Half of the Shevet should be on one side of the Ever HaYarden, the other half of the Shevet should be on the other side of the Ever HaYarden, because they wanted to taste what it would be like when Mashiach will come. What is the lesson which we can derive from this attitude of Shevet Menashe? Rabbi continues, and he says, Rabbi says that there are many individuals who think back, they say they're involved in many inyanim, they're involved in learning, involved in davening, and they daven properly as it should be, as it is required from a tamim, from a chassid to daven, and to daven ba'ariches, to daven, spend a lot of time into davening. At Shabbos, on Shabbos, and even not only on Shabbos, the Rebbe says even on the plain mincha, and a weekday mincha, we can find these people davening a mincha in a real special way. However, they claim, the Rebbe continues, we're demanding from them to go around and scream and talk about the fact that we want Mashiach now. And this, to say, is something we're already 1900 years in Golus, and the Rebbe will want to take us out of Golus. When the right time will come, he will take us out of Golus and will bring Mashiach. But of what value is it to go around now and talk about Mashiach? And go around publicly and whenever we meet people to tell them and introduce them to the idea that we want Mashiach now. And he says, in this country, everything has to be done properly. So naturally, the first thing we do, we meet a person, is we tell him good morning. Then we ask him how he is, how he's feeling. How do you do? That's the Rebbe's expression. Then the Rebbe says, we know the Baal Shem Tov has taught us that when we meet a person, we have to ask him how he feels, and how his family feels, and how his children feel, and how is his situation in Parnasa. So after going through all that, we've met the person, and we've asked him these questions, we feel it's kind of strange. How can we go ahead and continue and talk about we want Mashiach now? And this is the lesson which we have from the attitude of Shevet Menashe. And this is today's day. Ches Nisan. Menashe's attitude was that even then, when they entered Eretz Yisrael, they immediately wanted that they should have part of Ever HaYarden. Why did they want part of Ever HaYarden? Because Ever HaYarden is a territory which will be given to us when Mashiach will come. A much bigger part than we got when the Yidden entered Eretz Yisrael. So they wanted to remain, part of them should remain in Ever HaYarden. They should have a taste what Eretz Yisrael will be like when Mashiach will come. So this is to us a hero, a lesson to us that we nowadays, again, we also have to not satisfy just ourselves with our own learning, with our own davening, but it comes to a subject of talking like we want Mashiach now. This is a subject which we should not refrain ourselves from talking about it. On the contrary, we should be talking about this Indian to Yidden publicly and privately and so forth. And here the Rebbe says, he will relate an episode which happened to a shliach, to one of the shluchim. The Rebbe says he's sure that there are many similar episodes that had happened, which weren't even brought to his attention, but this one, he says, will show us the chashivas, the importance of every good act. The Rebbe described that there was one of his shluchim who came to visit another Yid and tried to influence him to become an observant Jew. This other Yid the Rebbe described was somebody who was not raised in an Orthodox home, who was raised in the environment of the Bund. The Bund is it's old Jewish organizations, the Arbitering and Bund, Jewish Workmen's Circle, socialists, right? This individual at the time, the Rebbe says, was a person who was doing very well, begashmias, and as well as beruchnias, as far as his understanding of what ruchnias was. A person who earned a very comfortable living and was set up very well, as just mentioned, begashmias and beruchnias. And the shaliach of the Rebbe was trying to convince him to change his way of life and to become an observant Jew. Rebbe says that he kept on complaining and saying that he wants to keep the same type of life which his fathers kept, that it was the home he was raised in. And in the course of this whole entire conversation, this individual paused for a moment and he turned to the side and took one of the books which he was involved in and opened one of his books to turn the pages in one of his books. It seems like the conversation broke for a few minutes or so, and as he turns around he sees that the Rebbe Shliach is standing there in his room in a corner and davening mincha. Didn't tell him anything, didn't ask him for permission that he wants to daven mincha in his office or something like it. But the Rebbe says the only thing is that the shliach felt that it's the time for mincha at sunset, and here he is in this person's office. He will be here for another while. He has no alternative. So what he did was he put himself into a corner and davened mincha. The individual in whose office whom he visited was extremely impressed with this act of seeing the Yid davening mincha in his office, more than the entire conversation and the entire dialogue which they had. What impressed them above all was the act of seeing the chassid, the shliach, davening mincha in his office. And the end result of the story was that this individual became an observant Jew, a Shema Torah mitzvahs. And not only, the Rebbe says, did he become a Shema Torah mitzvahs for himself, he became a neir lahoyer, to bring light to other people. The Rebbe says he has today influenced tens and hundreds or perhaps thousands of other Yidden to become close to Yiddishkeit and become observant Yidden. The Rebbe says here we see the greatness of one act, how great Mainsa is, one good act. Here we see what one mincha could lead to. And the same applies to any other good deed and good act. A good act and a good deed at times can have much more influence than all types of discussions and explanations and conversations and whatever, dialogues and whatever. One good deed can accomplish by far more than all of this. The Rebbe concluded, Tamu ra'u k'tayv Hashem. Taste it, do it, in other words, taste it, and you will see what the results will be. It's customary in the Farbrengen. As usual, the Rebbe continues in learning a Rashi in this week's Chazarah, and also a Rambam, which has a shaykhs to today's Shir and Rambam. Regarding the Rashi in this week's Chazarah, it's okay, I have permission, thank you. The Rebbe says there was a question raised last week, which the Rebbe did not give an answer to. The Rebbe says that he saw that there are many answers and explanations which were written in the various periodicals, the Ha'aretz HaTmimim, which are published weekly by the yeshivas. The Rebbe says we should simply call over a 5-year-old child who's learning Chumash, or a 6 or 7-year-old, and explain him what the question was, and see if he agrees to any of these answers, that this is an answer which he understands, and this is a proper answer, I'm sure to Shel Mikra. Regarding this week's Parsha, the Rebbe says there is something which is a very apparent and obvious question at the end of the Sedra, at Maftir. And it's a question which all the commentaries on Torah discuss this question. And Rashi, who should be the first one to comment on any union which is Negei Pshuta Shel Mikra, Rashi doesn't mention anything.
And that is in Kapitel Hey, Pasuk Lamed Gimel. The Torah tells us, don't go out of the Oyel Moed Shivas Yomim for 7 days. Ad Yom Meloisi Yimei Miloeichem, till the Shivas Yimei HaMiluim will finish. Ki Shivas Yomim Yimalei Yetchem. Then there's another pasuk, pasuk Lamed Hey. Upesach Oyel Moed Teishvu, sit at the entrance of the Oyel Moed. Yoimim v'layla, night and day, Shivas Yomim, u'shmartem es mishmeres Hashem, v'lo yisamusu ki chen tzavos. Very obvious question arises here. For when were they told not to leave the Oyel Moed? For the Shivas Yimei HaMiluyim, for these 7 days that the Mishkan was being dedicated. We read in Chumash, and it's discussed in Rashi at length, that these 7 days that the Mishkan was dedicated, every day the Mishkan was taken apart and again erected the next morning. So how does the Torah here tell them, don't go out of the Oyel Moed for full 7 days? And as it's repeated in the next pasuk, Yoimim v'layla, day and night, the Mishkan was taken apart in the evening. And at the next morning, the Mishkan was erected. And this question, everybody, Ramban discusses, and other Meforshei HaTorah, everybody raises this question. Rashi does not comment anything. For the child who's learning Chumash, this is a very obvious question. Why doesn't Rashi comment anything? And it's a question which obviously requires an interpretation. And still Rashi does not say anything regarding this question. So the Rebbe is learning. There's no need for Rashi to comment anything here. Why? Let us look into the Psukim. And we will notice that Pasuk Lamed Gimel and Pasuk Lamed Hey are two separate Psukim. In Pasuk Lamed Gimel, the Torah tells us, Umi Pesach Oyel Moed Lo Yiseitzu, don't go out of the Oyel Moed Shivas Yomim, Ad Melois Yimei Milueichem, until the 7 days of Miluyim, the Shivas Yimei Miluyim pass by. Ki Shivas Yomim, and he gives a reason. What's the reason? Ki Shivas Yomim Yimalei Yetchem. We come to Pasuk Lamed Hey. Here the Pasuk talks not only about day, the Pasuk talks about day and night. Yoimam v'layla. So what do we see right away? That there are two separate inyanim. There is one inyan, don't leave the Oyel Moed during the day. The day the Oyel Moed wasn't taken apart. The Oyel Moed was first taken apart at the end of the day and erected again the next morning. So there's nothing wrong with Pasuk Lamed Gimel. Self-understood. And the Torah in fact gives the reason. This is the Shivas Yimei HaMiluyim. Who is the told? Who's told to Aaron and his children, spend the entire Shivas Yimei HaMiluyim where the days in the Oyel Moed. Comes Pasuk Lamed Hey. Pasuk Lamed Hey tells us something different. Upesach Oyel Moed Teishvu. Pasuk Lamed Gimel says, don't go out of the Oyel Moed. In other words, don't go through the entrance of the Oyel Moed. If you want to get out of the Oyel Moed, you have to pass the entrance. Otherwise, you can't get out. So if the Torah tells us don't pass the entrance of the Oyel Moed, that means spend the entire day in the Oyel Moed. Here we have a completely different command. Pasuk Lamed Hey, the Torah tells us something completely different. Upesach Oyel Moed Teishvu, you shall sit at the entrance of the Oyel Moed. Sit there Yom v'layla, day and night. Shivas Yamim for 7 days. This is something entirely different commandment. And here it's given a different reason. Ushmartem es mishmeres Hashem. It's something where you will observe, you will pay tribute to the Oyel Moed by sitting on the outside of the Oyel Moed, Yomam v'layla, day and night, for these 7 days, for these Shivas Yimei HaMiluyim. So there's no more question how would they be able to be told to sit in the Oyel Moed Yomam v'layla. At the time the Oyel Moed was taken apart, at Laila, at evening, they weren't told that. They were told to sit outside of the Oyel Moed Yomam v'layla. It's 2 separate sivuyim. That's why Rashi, who's strictly limited to Pshat, is not confronted with any questions here. There's no question here. There's 2 separate psukim. Only Pesach Oyel Moed Lo Yiseitzu is one inyan. Pasuk Lamed Hey tells us something completely different. Pasuk Lamed Hey tells us, U Pesach Oyel Moed Teishvu, sit on the outside of the Oyel Moed Yomam v'layla. You see how every expression in the pasuk is accurate, and that's why there's no need for Rashi to comment on this. The Rebbe also went back to last week's Sedre. Last week it was discussed, at the beginning of Vayikra, Rashi comments that when the Rebbe was teaching to Moshe, he taught to him in a way that he gave him a break, a time to be able to think over the halachas which he was teaching him. So, question arises, the Rebbe has been talking to Moshe all along. Why is it when it comes to Pashas Vayikra, here we find this concept that the Rebbe is giving him time to think over bein parsha la parsha? Why didn't he need it before that? Last week the Rebbe didn't answer it, but today the Rebbe explained Pashas Vayikra is much harder. The inyanim which are discussed here are much harder than the inyanim which were discussed in Pashas Shmos. Vayikra is a much harder sedra. All the details of a karbanis which are discussed from here and after in Chumash Vayikra is much harder in Yonim. So that is why when the Rebbe learned with Moshe something which was easier, there was no need for him to give Moshe a chance to be able to a break between Parsha la Parsha, and Moshe should be able to think over what the Rabbeinu Shalom is teaching him. However, it's coming here to harder in Yonim. Vayikra Tzav, these are in Yonim which are involved with many, many details regarding the Karbanis, and it's in Yonim which are extremely complicated. So that is why when the Rebbe is teaching this here to Moshe Rabbeinu, he's giving him an opportunity, he's giving him a reidach ben Parsha la Parsha, so that he should be able to think over the Yonim and understand it better. Regarding the Rambam, today's Shir in the Rambam, for the learning of 3 prakim a day, the Siyum will be in a few more days. So today it is Hilchas Melachim, the first 3 prakim. In Hilchas Melachim, what is discussed is the great power which the Torah gave to a melech, to a Jewish king. And the Torah tells us how a Jewish king is supposed to be treated. At the same time, however, the Torah tells us how a king is supposed to behave. In other words, we are giving him a lot of honor and a lot of kavod, but he is not supposed to take all this for granted. He, in his own life, himself has to be very soft and very warm to everyone. And the details of what the Torah is telling us, and the Rambam brings it lahalacha, how a melech is supposed to act. The Rambam tells us, in Perek Beis of Hilchas Melachim, the Rambam says, HaMelech mistaper b'chol yoyim. The melech would take a haircut every day. U'mesaken atzmoi, u'misnoe b'levushim noim. He would be dressed in nice clothing, appropriate clothing for the king. And brings a pasuk, Shenema, Melech biyafyoi techzena einecha. You shall see a king in his beauty, in his glory. Then we are told that we are not allowed to see the king. Not a halach is in the Rambam. We're not allowed to see him when he's naked. Neither when he's taking a haircut. Neither when he's bathing. It's not appropriate. Even further, even when he's drying himself from his bath, we're also not allowed to be in the same room with a melech. Because it's not a kavod, it's not a proper derech eretz, it's not proper respect for a king to be with him at these times. Incidentally, the Rebbe says, there's
Ninyan from the Alter Rebbe in Shulchan Aruch regarding what the Rambam says, HaMelech mistaper b'chol yoyim, that a melech will take a haircut on every day. So in Hilchas Shabbos, there's an opinion which the Alter Rebbe brings that we are not allowed to take haircuts 3 days before Shabbos. Why? Because according to the one who says so, the hair begins growing after 3 days. So if we take a haircut 3 days before Shabbos, it begins growing on Shabbos. So the Alter Rebbe argues this opinion with this halacha. Alter Rebbe says, how can we say so? We know that HaMelech mistaper b'chol yoyim, and if the melech has to take a haircut every day, is a simon that hair grows immediately. Every day hair grows. It doesn't take a 3-day period for the hair to begin growing again. This is something which the Rebbe just mentioned incidentally. But getting into these halachas, obviously they're a little contradictory. The Rebbe is asking if we are not allowed to be in the king's presence when the king takes a haircut, so who should give him the haircut? If we're not allowed to be in his presence when he's baiting, so who would set up the merchatz for him? Especially in those days, how a merchatz had to be set up. There was need for somebody to set up the waters and so forth. Who would do it for him? Should we say, Rebbe goes further, should we say that the person who's doing it for him, who's giving him the service, he is permitted to do it? So there should be some sort of a mention in the Rambam that these halachas apply to everyone, except to the person who's giving him the haircut, except to his barber, to his personal barber, and to his personal people who are taking care of him. Even the Rebbe says if we should say that his eved, his slave, it's different. As it's explained in Chassidus, that a slave of an eved is not a metzius for himself. And that is why kol ma shekona eved kona rabbi, whatever belongs to a slave belongs to his master. As it's explained, the Rebbe says in Rishonim, because it's explained in Rishonim, the Rebbe says, that not the pshat that first belongs to the eved, and once the eved owns it, then it gets turned over to his master. It's explained that he has no metzias, he has no being of his own. And therefore anything which is his immediately becomes his master's. So we should use this approach to say that the eved of a melech is the same. He's no metzias for himself. And that is why he's part of being his master's. And whatever he does for his master, he has to give him all types of services. The Rebbe says still, it has not come out to say, there's no exception mentioned that for the eved of the melech it is different. So that is why the Rebbe says, the way it would seem to him to learn is the following way. We know that in later there was the Malchei Yehuda and was Malchei Beis David. The one, let us take for an example, a person who was a Malchus Beis David had to respect his Melech of Malchus Beis David. However, all these laws do not apply that he has to give the same respect to the king of Malchei Yisrael. In other words, after the Jewish kingdom was divided, and there were two kings ruling in Israel, there was the king of Judah and the king of Israel, Melech Yehuda, Melech Yisrael. A resident of Yehuda did not have to give these respects to the Melech of Yisrael, and vice versa. Memela, the Rebbe says, it would be very simple. They would have a very simple arrangement. For these types of services, they would invite somebody who is not under their jurisdiction. In other words, bring in an individual from Yehuda to Eretz Yisrael, bring in an individual from Eretz Yisrael into Yehuda, and they will do these services for the king, and they are not obligated to give this type of honor to the king. So they could bathe him, and they could give him haircuts, and all other types of services. It says there's, however, one question. If we look into this Rambam, we learn through the Prakim here in the Rambam, we see that Moshe Rabbeinu had the status of a melech. Rabbi discussed in today's Farbrengen, Moshe Rabbeinu had various statuses. He had the status of a Kohen Gadol. He did the Avodah in the Shivas Yimei HaMiluyim. Then afterwards, he became a Levi. He had the status of a Levi. And together with it, he is also considered a melech. So Moshe Rabbeinu was a melech. So all these halachas regarding a king pertain to Moshe Rabbeinu as well. When the Yidden were walking in the Midbar, the Yidden were surrounded with the clouds. They had no outsiders which they had anything in common with. So the question arises, in the Midbar, where Moshe was the Melech, who was able to provide Moshe with these services? To say that Moshe gave up, in other words, Taka didn't get a haircut every day and didn't get all these inyanim, the Rebbe said then Moshe would lead the Yidden. He would be over and lifnei iver l'sitei michshel, because the Yid, it is our obligation, it's the obligation of every single Yid to see to it that the Melech gets the proper honor, and this is part of the proper honor which has to be given to a Melech. So, what went on in the Midbar? There were no outsiders amongst the Yidden to say that they would call on a Gentile, they would call on a Goy or on somebody to give Moshe the services. One of the Yidden couldn't do it because we just discussed it's not proper to be with the king at that time. It's not respectful. Rebbe says, so question arises, how did Moshe Rabbeinu live up with these halachas? Which the Rebbe did not answer. Again, the Rebbe spoke about the great importance and the great inyan in making the Siyum and the Rambam, the Siyum celebrations which will be taking place all over the world this week and in the close by coming weeks. The conclusion of learning of the Rambam, and at the same time, like any inyan Torah, we don't stop. We always, whenever we make a stop, we begin right away. Just like we find with Chamisha Chumsha Torah, we say, in Simchas Torah we say, when we call up for Chassan Bereishis, we say, there's an Aramaic expression, Maskifin Siyuma Lahaschala. We always tie together the end and the beginning. So all these celebrations, which are going to be celebrations of concluding the Rambam, at the same time we will also celebrate the beginning of the new learning of the Rambam for the new season. Rebbe says that there was already a celebration in Morocco, in Fez, where the Rambam lived. The Rambam spent a lot of his time there. And there was a celebration of the Siyum on the Rambam in Morocco. The Rebbe says there are people here at the Farbrengen who had the schus to participate in that Siyum and are here with us now and brought mashke from that Siyum here to this Farbrengen. And therefore the Rebbe says he will take this mashke and give it to be used in the Siyumim and Rambam, which will be taking place before Pesach here in New York locally. But at the same time asked that the entire mashke be used before Pesach and should not be sold in the chametz, but the mashke should be distributed at the Siyumim, at the Siyumei HaRambam. Chab also mentioned we find an interesting halacha in Yeredeya. In the halachas of respecting one's rabbi, kavod rabbi, there's a halacha that a person is prohibited to compare himself to Moshe Rabbeinu. No one can say that he is like Moshe. At the same time, the Rebbe says we find something of interest. On the Rambam's Matzeve, which is in Tveria, there's an engraving of Mi Moshe ad Moshe Leikam Ke Moshe, which means from Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe ben Amram, till Moshe ben Maimon, to the Rambam, there was no one as great during all these years. So we see that the Rambam is compared to Moshe Rabbeinu. And the Rebbe says he's definite that the people who were involved in setting up the Matzeva for the Rambam were responsible people. And besides, during the years, there were outstanding Gedolei Yisrael ha'amitiyim, sincere Gedolei Yisrael, true Gedolei Yisrael in the fullest sense of the word, who visited the tomb of the Rambam, the cave of the Rambam, and they paid attention to this line which is engraved on his matzevim in Moshe ad Moshe lekam ke Moshe. So it's definitely so that it's agreed by everyone the greatness of the Rambam, greatness of Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu's inyan was also Torah. Though, as just mentioned previously, Moshe excelled many in Yonim. Moshe was a king, and Moshe was a Kohen Gadol, and Moshe was a Levi. However, what was Moshe really noted for? Moshe's inyan is Torah. Zichru Torahs Moshe Avdi. Moshe goes hand in hand with Torah. Aaron, his inyan was chesed, kindness. Aaron always expressed chesed to the people. He took an interest in everyone. Moshe's inyan was Torah. Here the Rebbe expressed himself that by learning Torah, we can accomplish tremendous inyanim. If we're lacking an inyan spiritually, the Rebbe says, we are to learn regarding this inyan in Torah, the inyan which we are lacking. And Torah will be able to replace us and fill in this inyan. The Rebbe mentioned if a person is looking to excel in Chochmah and Bina, in wisdom and understanding, is learn Chassidus, which Chassidus is Chochmah and Bina, and this will give you Chochmah and Bina. And the same, the Rebbe says, applies to other inyanim as well. Torah has this hidden koyach within it, that when a Yid learns Torah, and he's lacking certain inyanim, and he's learning these inyanim which he's looking to gain for himself spiritually, this will be an assistance, a spiritual assistance, that he will gain these inyanim. Mela, again, the Rebbe spoke about the greatness of the Rambam, and the greatness of the Sefer of the Rambam, which is something which the Rambam wrote, Ka Kotoin, Ka Godoil. He's written the Sefer for small and big, and as the Rambam himself writes, that this Sefer is written so that one who goes through Chamisha Chumshe Torah and afterwards wants to get his knowledge in Torah, in all parts of Torah, he can learn the Sefer of the Rambam. And that is the Yad HaChazaka, the Mishnah Torah of the Rambam. If one goes through Mishnah Torah from the beginning to the end, he gets his knowledge and his understanding of all of the Inyanim in Torah. And again, the Rebbe urged that these siyumim be made all over, with participation of as many people. It should be made in a befitting way, and together with it, as the expression goes, Oisim Suda L'Gemara Shel Torah, that at the same time when there's a completion of an inyan in Torah, a Suda, a festive meal, is also served at the same time, which is a celebration of the great Simcha involved. Rabbi stressed again, kept on stressing the greatness of learning Rambam, and everyone should participate and see to it to get more participants in the shiurim of the Rambam. The Rebbe concluded the Farbrengen that being that we're going now, excuse me just 1 second please, the Rebbe said he will also make his siyum on the Rambam, Berlin Neder, in the Farbrengen of the evening of Yud Aleph Nis. In other words, Monday night Mitzvah Shem in the Farbrengen, the Rebbe will also make a siyum on the Rambam. The Rebbe concluded the Farbrengen that we are beginning to Mincha, we are beginning to read the Sedra of Shmini, which begins with the words, Vayihi Bayom Hashmini, it was on the 8th day. And as we discussed this week and last week, this is the 8th day of the dedication of the Mishkan. Chazal tell us, Oisei Hayoim Notal Eser HaToros. It was a very special day. That day was crowned with 10 different crowns. Very significant day. The Rebbe said, let us be zeiche to all these big crowns, but together with it, by Yom HaShmini. Shmini has a shaychus to Mashiach, because the Chazal tell us, Kinder shel Mashiach, the harp of Mashiach, will be a harp of Shmoina Nimin, will have 8 strings. Let it be that we should be able to be zeiche immediately to the inyan of Shmini, 8, number 8, in the sense of the coming of Mashiach, whose harp will be a harp of 8 strings. Abu Tavach.